Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. We have with us back for another round of my rambling questions, Adam Koontz. He is the pastor at Trinity Lutheran Church in Denver, Colorado. Welcome back, Adam.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
So what I want to talk with you about today is, so recently kind of in the Lutheran blogosphere world or the Twitter patients of LCMS Lutherans, kind of like has blown up this like women in the church and women and the order of creation. And so like on one side, you got people saying like theology isn't just for the boys anymore. And, women can do anything, but they can't be a pastor. But it kind of sounds like they think they can be pastors. And then you've got kind of the other side who are saying, no, Paul is very clear. There's an order of creation. He bases his arguments in the book of Genesis. And then like even further still, you kind of have folks saying like, well, women's proper place is, in submission to men because they're made in the image of man, not in the image of God. So you kind of like this plethora of things that are kind of swirling about. Yeah. And so what I want to talk with you about today is kind of like putting forward what does the Bible actually say about women within the order of creation, and what does God then positively give them to do? Because it seems like we're always kind of trying to talk about, we're trying to talk about what could they do, or what might they do, or how far is too far, instead of just saying, here's what God has actually given. So can you kind of paint for us the picture of God's view of godly womanhood as it exists in the church?
So as it exists in the church, as it exists per se, because when we're talking about what are called the orders of creation, which is a term originating in the 19th century to describe confusions they were already having about the nature of life, particularly in the state in 19th century Europe, but also between the sexes increasingly and within the church to some degree, although they have their own controversies. When we're talking about the orders of creation, we're talking about things that are biblically revealed, but also naturally revealed. That is, they are not just part of what's called special revelation, which is God's revelation to us in Scripture, but also general revelation, so that the nations as well as the church can grasp these things to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. And because we're thinking about that, it is going to be helpful to reflect on how the nations have grasped these things, not only how the church has discussed them throughout time, because part of what we're dealing with is a social reality within the church of something changes outside the church doesn't say anything about it, and then the church just accepts the change because it really has no way to think about it constructively. And that is such a common occurrence, particularly in the Missouri Synod, particularly in American churches, that I don't really have to narrow that down to just discussion of what men and women are supposed to do. So when we're talking about the orders of creation, we're talking about general life realities. How has God set up life to be? If you want to use a specific theological word for what this would be the first use of the law. Particularly, okay. Just how is everything built, and if I go against it, what happens, and how am I curbed because I'm trying to oppose God's setup for life? Mm-hmm. When we talk about it that way, it's helpful to begin with the idea that both in English, but also in the original Hebrew of Genesis, she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. She shall be called Isha because she was taken out of Ish. And what is essential to the relationship between man and woman, and I'm going to say man and woman. I'm not going to say husband and wife. And I'm not going to talk specifically about the church, because the biblical vision is creational. It's not simply ecclesiastical.
Mhm.
That man and woman are related to each other. They are not necessarily, okay, they don't have to be, that is, in conflict with each other. They're not there to antagonize each other, and they're not, except under a curse,
Right.
in any kind of power struggle. But they
Mhm.
are distinct. So they're related but distinct. And that basic insight, I think, has become easier to articulate of late, simply because we're trying to explain to people, tell this 14-year-old girl why she should keep being a girl and should
Yeah.
develop into a woman. So at that point, it becomes easier to understand why these things are issues and why distinctive ways of life for men and women should exist, because we are having to think more incisively about what a woman is. Whereas maybe over the past 50 years, which is the time since which particularly women's daily lives and therefore families' daily lives in the United States have changed very radically.
Mhm.
It's really like after the 1960s that happens. So beginning in the 70s.
So
Um,
is
yeah,
so is so is this a case in which kind of, we're typically used to talking about um, vocation, vocation of husband or wife,
yeah,
vocation of children,
right.
vocation as citizen or ruler. Is this taking vocation back to some more fundamental things, like you have a calling to be a man, you have a calling to be a
Yeah,
woman?
right. Yeah, and this is pretty easy to see on the male side. It just doesn't have the same political wrapping either inside the church or outside the church, or political freight,
Hmm.
that when we talk prescriptively about womanhood, people necessarily get upset because the sexes have been weaponized against each other for a long
Hmm.
time. Easy way to tell this is that um, what the Missouri Synod will argue about is everything besides the pastoral office, which was
Right.
enough of a fight on its own, right?
Hmm.
Of a
Yeah.
certain vintage. But why are we doing that? Well, we're doing it because there is presumptive conflict, embarrassment, and confusion about this issue. We don't argue about the practice of infant baptism because
Hmm.
we're not societally embarrassed by it generally, and it's not controversial among us. So
Okay.
when conflict recurs in a church body or a marriage or a congregation, the question isn't ever just what is the state of the what is the state of the problem, state of the question.
Hmm.
It's why do we keep talking about this? And I think the reason we keep talking about this is because we don't go all the way back to this fundamental issue that's now raised by the advent of widespread rapid onset gender dysphoria among teenage girls in high schools.
Yeah.
um, we don't say what is a woman. We say
Mhm.
what is a wife, and then when that happens, you're already assuming whatever you're assuming about how marriage is supposed to work, which probably has to do with what your parents were like and what your mom was like and blah 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 blah. And at the point where you're having an argument about things that are already ongoing, so people are like being wives in different ways.
Yeah.
They're working outside the home, or they're not working outside the home. They're
Mhm.
ferociously convinced that they should work outside the home. They're ferociously convinced that no one should work outside the home. At that point, obviously, you're not going to have a productive discussion because you aren't really sure what a woman is. You're just assuming what a woman is, and then you're saying on that basis, here's what a wife is. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
there's an issue here of going to vocations that are in the whole scheme of things secondary to primary things that we haven't usually considered as vocations because we didn't think of them as
Yeah.
in need of development, but they in fact do. You have to. You're born biologically male. You have to learn to be a man.
Yeah.
You're born biologically female. You have to learn to be a woman.
Mhm. So you have to grow in wisdom and stature
You
within
have to,
that
yeah,
particular
you
calling.
have to, yeah, and
Mhm.
and in Proverbs, that's specific at the beginning and the end to the
Right.
kind of woman that the son who is the addressee of Proverbs either should not associate with or needs to marry. But
Mhm.
the development of the woman. So if you think about Proverbs 31, just take one example, that she is diligent. Okay. Diligence is an exercise for man and for woman against the flesh.
Yeah.
And her diligence in provision for her household is diligence in well-doing for the role that is particularly hers. So
Mhm.
one way to think about this is that if we talk about roles for men and women in different parts of life, whether in a family or a congregation or something, you have to think of them as the roles are there. Like, these are the lines that Hamlet has, but I have to learn how to play that role well and
Mhm.
and to take on that role well. And that's a little bit of a different idea than vocation. It doesn't contradict it. It's just a little different. But
Yeah.
I do think I do think it's helpful because I, in my experience, it lowers the temperature of these discussions
Mhm.
because they're just there's like a presumptively enormous amount of self-righteousness that people have when they're trying to explain why they have chosen to do with their own lives what they have done with their own lives.
Mhm.
and I mean, how will I obtain wisdom if I already know everything?
Right.
So, yeah. So I think you have to start with what a woman is. She's related to a man. Um, she is distinctive from him, and as you
Mhm.
progress through Genesis, and then through the entirety of the Old Testament, which is usually one of our best sources for orders of creation, the woman is a mother to the living, like Eve.
Mhm.
She also is overseeing the entirety of the household, which is biblically not just a space for psychological relationships between people of varying ages. It's also an economic unit.
Yeah.
And I don't think that actually has changed among us. I think it's just configured differently. But the household is the basic economic unit, and she's overseeing provisioning that basic economic unit.
Yeah, she's
She
the
is
house
related to,
despot.
yeah, right. Which is kind of your classic Luther German way to put it.
Yeah.
And so that what she has is a sphere that is relative to man's sphere more intimate. That is, it's closer. She's both geographically not going off to war. Men over the age of 20 are doing that. So she's not going as far away from home very often as men do, but um, it's intimate in the sense of being dominated by very personal and generally in a biblical frame familial relationships. And
Mhm.
those familial relationships are so close because older generations are even incorporated into the household. That's why Jesus is going to reference conflict between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law at the because of his gospel coming, right? He
Mhm.
has not come to bring peace but a sword. He's not making like a wry reference to the fact that you resent the way that your mother-in-law runs family Christmas and you want to run your own Christmas celebration the way we do, because we kind of presume that people hate each other. Teenagers are supposed to hate their parents. Wives are supposed to think their husbands are stupid. Um, older females resent younger females. I mean, we presume a lot of conflict that the Bible does not presume. Not that people are perfect, but that they don't have to be ineluctably opposed to each other. The mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, the reason that's a painful separation that Jesus would mention is because they generally live together.
Mm.
That the older generation is going to be incorporated into the rising or physically responsible generations life as they get older and have less energy and are still contributing to the household.
Mhm.
So the daughter-in-law, in that case the wife, comes into her husband's family. The Bible is not matriarchal or matrilineal as even modern Judaism is. It is patriarchal. The father is the head of the family, and it is patrilineal. Your inheritance is through your father, and a lot of
Mhm.
the discussion of salvation in the Bible is, anchored in the fact that rescue and inheritance and adoption and grace and all the rest of it come patriarchally through in this life through the Father, and in the life everlasting through the capital F Father, who adopts us as specifically sons so that we can actually inherit things. Within that household, the mother has the role of concord with the father. So if you look at Proverbs, for example, the wisdom offered to the son is both the father's wisdom and the mother's wisdom. So she also has a teaching role within this household. What I would stress no one has is a notion of independence. That's just it's just not really, certainly on the familial scale, it's not biblical. The husband is the head. A head is not independent of the body.
Right.
And the body is not independent of the head.
Yeah. So is this St. Paul in Corinthians where he's talking about the husband is head of the wife's body and the wife is the head of the husband's body. This maybe it's not interdependence, but they don't control their own thing. The spheres are really overlapping.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, the warfare that the husband
circles or
that's right.
Things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about warfare or you think about political changes in Israel, which are generally overwhelmingly male. I mean, certainly the military is staffed by men exclusively, but higher officials, not only priests, but also the royal family are overwhelmingly male. Female involvement is pretty minimal. And the greatest female involvement is going to come from wicked women like Jezebel or Athaliah. But that male involvement, one index of its corruption, which is in Samuel's prophecy about the nature of kingship and what kings are going to do when Israel is asking for a king, is that they will decimate your household. They will take things away from your household, and they will take away your sons and your daughters, so that they will be alienated from the household, which is the heart of Israel's life and the unit of inheritance, to which everything about Israel's law is going to recur in the Sabbath year, and especially in the Jubilee year, when supposedly everything is reset, so that the household that was given that land by God is returned to that land, whatever its debts or misfortunes have been. So the household is the basic unit of life. When we say this way, when we talk about what the Lutherans would call the three estates, the family, the church, and the state, is that the family is the basic unit of life. The other two live out of the family's existence. So when we say that, like, the husband gets to go 400 miles away to fight in a war or whatever the case may be, the point of that war, if it's a righteous war for the sake of Israel, if it's upholding the Lord's cause, is going to be for the welfare of the household. It's not there because he wants to have his fun or something. and
this isn't Achilles going away to get glory.
And she just doesn't get to. The perversions of that, or the permutations of that, the twistings of that. The one that is probably most notable in the Old Testament is polygamy. Exists when and where Israel begins to practice not only the sexual mores of the nations around it, but underneath that and before that, the idolatry of the nations around it. And then its marital life and its household life begins to conform to the life of the nations. And so, if they're going to practice syncretism with the religion, the Canaanite religion that, for instance, Jezebel grew up practicing, her relationship to Ahab is very commanding. And that's not really accidental, because out of their idolatry together, Ahab and Jezebel's, flows a change in the male-female relationship that will necessarily, in that case, it gives her much greater emotional and psychological power over him, and she is kind of a sterner character than he is. In the case of, say, Abraham or Jacob or many others after them, their polygamy is the very thing that involves them in all manner of horrible life complications and sins. And it's going to be the source of great difficulty simply politically, not to
Mhm.
speak of other things, in David's life. There is a reckoning and a bloodshed at Solomon's, ascent to power that
Yeah.
is necessary because his father was a polygamist. So the thing that you can see, going back to this idea of the first use of the law, is that when you are messing with the relationship that the sexes should have to each other in a household that is monogamous in the way that the Lord himself, Hosea, Ephesians 5, the Lord himself is monogamous. He has only one bride. When you mess with that, you incur your own penalty. The
Mhm.
penalties are sitting right there in the course that life will take because you have chosen to build your life in a way opposed to the Lord's design.
Yeah. And that's uh, pretty prevalent within Proverbs, that
Yeah.
chasing those things actually brings you death, not life.
Yeah. And I mean, there is a connection here that I find in practice, people generally have. Maybe this is part of the difficulty of longer lifespans for more of the population in modern life, but they have that realization often after it is too late for one or more generations, after them to profit from the realization. So they realize too late, for example, that they were conforming their life to the dictates of money making, or they were conforming their life to the dictates of what they saw on TV about how, mom and dad are supposed to relate to each other, or whatever the case was. And at the time it seemed normal or whatever. It didn't seem shallow or stupid. And then they realize later on how that has affected them, or how their choice to, you know, um, whatever, get divorced then later affected their kids and their kids' ability to form lasting marital relationships and stuff like that. And the reason to point this stuff out is not to sort of gloat over it. I mean, that's sort of pointless. Um, it's because if we've collectively failed at the pursuit of wisdom, and the difficulty there is, and if you want to do inside baseball, maybe this is the time. The difficulty there is that wisdom is a spiritual and individual pursuit, in addition to being a somehow theologically formulated and collective pursuit. Meaning, I can be told what I should be as a man or a woman over and over again by the pastor, assuming I am. Generally, I'm probably not in your average Lutheran church. We're probably not talking about these things with much incisiveness or depth because they're sensitive and awkward. But
Mhm.
let's say that I am. In that case, I need to be growing in wisdom. I need to pray about the wisdom that I need. James chapter 1. I need some basic idea of what it is that I'm pursuing, right? So let's say that I'm trying to grow wiser in how I do or don't talk about my husband to my friends. Okay, this is kind of a
Mhm.
thing that comes up in marital counseling and premarital counseling. Out of marital counseling, I learned certain things to tell people in premarital counseling. Um,
Right.
right? Like, basically, don't talk to other people about your husband. Don't talk to other people about your wife. It's probably not productive. And guess what? You live with them, so you can just talk to them.
Mhm.
That might be good if you guys talked about it. But let's say that I know I need to do that. Well, what I need is a common standard of principle. I don't need like a document that tells me, in this case, like, basically, I don't need to be programmed like a human robot because I can't be,
Right.
because I have a principle about, say, what does a gentle and quiet spirit that is recommended for the wife in 1 Peter 3, why would that be recommended to her specifically, and how does that play out in her individual marriage? There's a principle there. How I learn to make it play out relies on two things. One is my desire to have it play out. And then two, the fact that the group will uphold the principle for me as I figure out what that actually looks like. So
Mhm.
if, analogously, we put people in a position as if they were playing baseball But, depending on the person's preference, we just took third base away. So, like that person never has to hit triples. They only hit home runs and doubles and singles. And sometimes they get walks. But other people can go there if they want to, but we're not really sure if it's actually has to be part of the game. We know historically there were 4 bases on the diamond, but we don't know if you see how confusing that is for everyone. And so if there are people trying to play 4-base baseball, they're like, why doesn't everybody do this? This is what we've always done. And then other people are like, well, you don't have to do it that way. There are plenty of stadiums that only have 3 bases on the diamond, but it's still a diamond. So there's all kinds of strange things here. And I think it's basically impossible to get anywhere in discussions about wisdom, womanhood, manhood, whatever, if the group doesn't have some idea that they're pursuing certain principles of wisdom. So, I mean, conversely, the Lutheran Church has, and this has its own difficulties and problems, but it has a fairly stringent discussion of how you're supposed to talk to people when you have a problem with them. That's why Matthew 18 is kind of a meme in Lutheran churches.
Right.
because we do kind of have a standard of wisdom for these things, and it's kind of easy immediately to recognize you really didn't handle this the right way. Now, I might agree with you or I might not, or we might need to figure out if this was a public sin or not, and some people are not aware of that permutation of the issue, but we do kind of have a standard. Whereas with like women outside the chancel, we don't really have much of a standard. Or women outside of the pastoral office, I shouldn't say outside the chancel, because that's something we don't agree on. And I don't think that we, I don't think that we disagree out of just overwhelming malice from anyone. I think we disagree because the capacity to come to collective decisions that would impinge upon people's daily lives is not there, or the will to do so is not there, or the sense that we could do so. So a certain hopelessness about it is there. And the problem is that those really practical daily things are the stuff that is most confusing to people.
Yeah. So, and you kind of get that sense of, I think, what you're describing when you hear just focus on the youth, and you'll catechize them out of whatever it is. The problem is they're getting the reverse catechesis everywhere else.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so the problem just continues, and we don't actually make any headway on coming to terms with what the principle actually is.
Right. So, like, to give a concrete example of this, right? So we're very firm at this point. Thank God, it's good. That only men should be pastors. Okay. But the way that is often explained makes it sound as if the church is this area, or not even the church. Let's just say the pulpit and the area directly in front of the altar during the celebration of communion.
Yeah.
Okay. Are places that, for reasons of grand exception or because of the maleness of Christ, are remanded only. Those things are only for men. And then you can surround that with whatever kind of rhetoric you want. You can just say it flatly. You can say it apologetically. You can whatever rhetorically you want to do. And the problem there is that is much harder to understand than the idea that there are various parts of life that are what they are because men have certain roles within them that are distinct from women's roles. Rather than saying that there's this one role, like of all the things that you could do on the, what do I want to be when I grow up survey that you are going to take in 9th grade. The only one that only boys can do is to be Lutheran pastors. It just doesn't make that much sense. It doesn't make sense of a lot of things that a kid who's in 9th grade could also notice about life. So he could, let's say he notices that most of the people that are doing, like he's going to get his learner's permit soon. Let's say he's a farm kid. So he gets an early learner's permit. He's driving And he's driving with his dad sometimes, and he notices that his dad reacts in certain ways to things on the road, and his mom reacts in different ways, and they see different things. So he knows that, just like he knows that mom and dad are not just different in psychological ways, they're different in ways that other moms and other dads seem to be different from each other. And he's driving through a construction site, and he notices that the women are holding the signs, or the women are on walkie-talkies, but don't have noticeable like tar on their jeans. And the people running the heavy construction equipment and, mucking around with the shovels and the rakes as they're rebuilding the asphalt are all men. So what you've taught him, if you're teaching him that it's just the pastoral office that's affected by this gender dichotomy, then you're saying all of the rest of that is completely random. And it's completely random that the only girl on the football team is the kicker. And it's completely random that this and that and the other thing that he can observe with his own eyes.
Yeah.
Okay, and has already at his age. It's much easier to say, and I think simpler to say, that the reason that men are in the pastoral office exclusively is because men are in a variety of other very similar offices throughout the entirety of life, involving things particular to men that therefore also have their own particular dangers. So an example of that is when Paul is, exhorting men, he exhorts them not to raise their hands in anger, because there are vices specific to the sex given particular physical strength or given particular intensity of physical energy and effort that are not the vices given to the female sex, or dangerous to the female sex, let's say. So I think that the way that we've talked about this has become rather nonsensical, especially because for our kids, the world has put all of those things up in the air. So the world would have you believe that every second airline pilot is a woman. It's not true. Okay. Or
Right.
every, whatever, and so these things that they themselves know, or they're being propagandized to about.
Yeah.
We can't really act like that stuff is random, or there's no design there, or if there is no design there, right? Like it just doesn't matter. It's fine. Then we need to be clear about that. And then I'm not really sure that we need to keep the pastoral office only for men. I mean, why the grand exception?
Right. I think you raise a good point, because I just was reading kind of a fairly recent book by kind of an opponent to the patriarchal biblical womanhood movement, kind of, within the church in general. And she makes this, which I think is a great point. Her point is, these high-ranking officials within the church keep saying this is just in the church, or this is just in the home, and yet it always bleeds over into the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So then why just the church and just the home? And so she's raising this very issue that you're pointing out, which is if it doesn't affect the world, then why does it affect the home, and why does it affect the church?
Right. Yeah.
Right? So that's going to be her argument, right?
That's right.
So
yeah, and because the spheres are, she's right, they are interconnected. And so
exactly,
logics operative in one of them will become logics operative in other parts of them. It doesn't mean that therefore, the county government is going to be operated according to the teachings of 1 Timothy all of a sudden. But it does mean that the way that God has set up life, especially in the case of the existence of two sexes and then their respective attributes, that is going to be operative, because those people, at the county office or in your congregation or at your school or whatever, were designed in a certain way by the Creator, and they will operate in those ways, whether or not we want to admit that those things pertain. So it is an opposition to that distinction between the sexes. that is probably the cause of, let's say, greatest consternation within the church. And I know that we have talked about this before, and it is sort of tiresome to mention again, but generations have an enormous amount of disconnect with each other, not only because of media consumption, perhaps, but also because the stakes of certain things are not apparent to people. So younger guys will tell me this about, you don't understand how hard it is to find a girl today. So many are convinced that men are evil, or that they want to be boys, or whatever, or they have been extremely promiscuous in their relatively brief years. So there's trouble there that was not even there for me, let alone someone 30 years older than I am. In addition to that, there are consequences of changes that people were not dealing with when Mary Tyler Moore was first on TV being a career woman. That is, almost nobody in America, when that show was originally airing in, I think, the 70s, had actually been raised by a working mother. Very, very few people had. So it was sort of it was like, you don't really know how to swim, and this is the first time you've been, 20 yards out from the shore. Right now, you feel pretty good.
Yeah.
You've never been tired. You've never encountered an undertow, and you're not very far away. Yeah. And we're a lot farther out now. And maybe we know how to swim a little better, but we understand more about what we have done now than we did then when we were beginning to do these things.
Yeah, no, I get you. I mean, I get this same analogy. I used to love roller coasters as a kid. And I recently went on one. I didn't get sick or anything. It wasn't that. But all I could think of is the whole time is all the things that could go wrong. Like every single thing that could break. My seatbelt was checked by a 15-year-old kid, and I'm just thinking, I don't think this is right. And I haven't been on one since. But I think it illustrates the same point, right? That the farther away you get from those things, you just they get magnified. Like when you're hitting a golf ball,
right?
And you have a slight open face on your club, it starts off pretty nice, and then you get this huge banana slice. So,
yeah, and I think that if you want to be angry about that, you're certainly welcome to be angry, but a gentle answer turns away wrath. And the wrath that proceeds on either side of this issue is usually respectively from a certain keen experience of consequence that previous generations didn't have. So I mean, younger people seem to be extremely depressed very often, and when they're not depressed, or even when they are, they're often very angry about the way their parents were, the way their parents are raising their siblings, et cetera, on and on and on and on. On the other side is a certain defensive wrath that, maybe I can admit that I did this wrong, or I did that wrong, or that this is a problem, or maybe I'm willing to, I shape my life in a certain way, but I'm willing to listen to you suggest that maybe I shouldn't have done that, but probably not. And so there will just be anger on both sides. When that is the case, I mean, it's almost like the reason I'm doing this podcast is because I hope that like 1 in 5 people will actually be thoughtful about these things, because I'm pessimistic that a majority of people can be, because it pertains to decisions that you've made about your life and your children and your money and the kind of house you live in and the kind of vacations you go on and all kinds of other things that for so long we just didn't discuss, and we didn't because I guess we didn't think that life was subject to God's judgment. I don't know. Like it was just kind of all whatever you want to do. And if that's the case, then that's fine. But then don't try to assert that there's some kind of specific design for life that God has.
Yeah. It's kind of like, so when I talk to kind of like folks my parents' age, And I don't mean this in a derogatory way. Like, if we could just get back to such and such a time, or even people my age, like, kind of pining for the early 90s or the late 80s, when you could walk around the mall and see all kinds of different things, right?
Yeah.
Or on Friday night, cruise around the mall and, wave at girls you would never talk to ever again.
There you go.
Or even right then and there. That I sort of say, look, if you're watching a bad movie and you stop in the middle and you rewind it thinking that it's going to come out different, that is a fool's errand.
Yeah.
Right. We have what we have now because of what happened then.
Yeah.
And this is all playing out. So it's not rewinding a movie. We got to get a new movie.
Yeah. And, the role of normalcy here, or the power of normalcy, matters a lot, because the desire to be normal, which I understand and certainly could be recommended to many in our circles in a social sense for sure, is just being a little more normal, is not evil. But to shape your life in a way that is socially normal, only works, whether you're Christian or not, only works if the society to which you are, after which you're patterning your life, what you perceive to be its social norms, is in fact aligned with God's design. So if God's design is for man and woman to be distinct, and then also to have interlocking but distinct spheres in life, then our society is not the place to find that reflected. And so you have there a pretty keen choice in what you're going to do with your life. Yeah. And that choice has not been one that was necessary for a very long time, and perhaps for the vast majority of Christian history, for most Christians. You're not going to find extensive discussion of the relationship between the sexes in Reformation era documents, apart from the idea that marriage is natural and normal, because much of what was natural and much of what was biblically authorized was utterly uncontroversial.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah.
Yeah. So we exist, we live in the world, but we're not of it, but we breathe its poisonous air. And so, often we end up kind of looking a lot like the world. What you're describing here is that man and woman have a particular design that is distinct but related.
Right.
So what are the points of relation between man and woman, what are the points of distinction of, in particular, women, but also men and women?
So the points of relation are partly creational and are partly redemptive. And in the redemptive sphere, the relationship is, and the overlap is entire. A man is not saved differently than a woman is. That's also why I'm really wary of talking about the pastoral office as uniquely male, because uniquely ecclesiastical, because the church is actually a place of less distinction between the sexes than the rest of creation, because the goods of salvation are available liberally to people irrespective of sex or race or employment or whatever. I mean, that is the meaning of Galatians 3:28. There is no male or female in Christ, right? So the overlap in the sphere of redemption is entire. The creational relationships.
There's no partiality.
No, there is no partiality, right? So, I mean, it's the same thing as saying that there is no Jew nor Greek. I mean, Paul, of all people, knows that there are Jews and there are Greeks, and they're very different, right? But those differences are in the realm of creation altogether. So, the relationship between the sexes in creation, you're dealing with another human being. You're dealing with someone who has emotions. You're dealing with someone who has thoughts. You're dealing with someone who has good or bad sleep habits, all these kinds of things that are common to human beings. You're
Yeah.
not dealing with someone who processes those emotions or those thoughts or those sleep habits or that desire for revenge or that desire for love or physical affection or whatever in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And acting like those distinctions are not visible even to those who have none of the light of the Word of God is silly.
Yeah.
It's silly in a marriage. I mean, it's sometimes fatal to a marriage to
Yeah.
act as if the man is going to talk in the same way or at the same length or with the same necessity as the woman about all the same things, as if they live in this world in a way that is experientially identical.
Mm-hmm.
So those distinctions are going to begin inside the person without his really necessarily understanding what the distinctions are. That's why as these roles are learned, whether they're man or whether they are husband or whether they are mother or wife, as these roles are learned, you are discovering things that are already there. It's not just that you're
Mm-hmm.
learning new habits, you're discovering realities that are already there of which you were unaware, that
Mm-hmm.
you hear certain things very differently from your spouse or whatever the case may be. So,
Yeah, and you see this if
yeah.
you have siblings who are of different sexes, right?
Oh,
I
totally.
mean,
Yeah.
I can see this just in my own children. You know, the way the boys process it and the way the girls process it, and then as the boys learn that they can't speak to their sisters the way that they speak to their brothers,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
or or that the sister can't expect the brother to do things the way her sister's going to do
Right.
it.
That's right. Yeah.
It's just kind of, I mean, it's in a way it's kind of joyful to watch. And in a way it's kind of, not maddening, but like, difficult to see this
Yeah.
unfold right in front of your eyes.
Yeah. Because you can see for the one who doesn't have the same amount of wisdom about boys and girls that this is going to be a problem, that your
Yeah.
sister is going to intuit things about you emotionally that your brother won't, but
Right.
you're expecting them both to intuit the thing, and it's just not going to happen.
Right.
But you have to learn that by bitter experience. It's kind of like I can't say that in advance, and then you're just going to know it and be fine with it. You kind of there are things that most of us or almost all of us have to learn by experience. That is the reason. I mean, it's not just like I want to be winsome thing. That's the reason that I don't want to talk about these things or with harshness. Because when
Yeah.
you're dealing with wisdom, you're dealing with a combination of knowing what the Word of God says, which, I mean, churches pay every single day for their biblical ignorance. Everyone does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you have to, it's a combination of what does the Word of God say, along with what has experience taught me about how that plays out. Okay. And the father in Proverbs is trying to save the son some time, but you'll notice that he's generally not giving direct, like in the case where someone does X, you do A, and where they do Y, you do B. He'll give him general principles, which the son can then put into practice. But because things have to be put into practice, and because I'm not saved by my works or whether my wife is working at home according to Paul's admonition, or whether I am, raising my children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, I'm not saved by those things. Because of that, I don't need to be angry and absolutist about it, which I would be about the gospel. If we were perverting the gospel, then I could say, cursed be anyone who perverts these things, as Paul does in Galatians. But because all of this is in the realm of wisdom, if we're willing to learn from Scripture together, to learn especially what these principles are for these different realms of life, then infinite patience and love can be exercised with each other.
Yeah.
It's because we're not learning from Scripture, we're basically just talking out of our life experience and the choices we've made, that there is biting and devouring, particularly on the topic of manhood and womanhood.
Yeah. So, I mean, is there a point at which these topics of manhood and womanhood end up biting into the gospel itself, or is it just an exercise in biblical wisdom?
Well, biblical wisdom is related to salvation, but it is not the same thing. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm saying. But its relationship is this, that if I pursue a life of folly, I will in time slide into ultimate folly, which is not to fear God any longer.
Hmm.
So that's why it's not an accident that the pursuit of vastly altered relationships between men and women, let's just take a really clear example, right? And we're saying this is not merely an ecclesiastical reality. It is that, and it's so much more.
Yeah.
When a church pursues women's ordination, it always ends up denying the authority of Scripture and then the authority thereby of God's voice, and therefore the content, the existence, the necessity of the gospel. The reason
Mhm.
for that is once I have rejected something that I have seen to be true, what else will I not reject in the pursuit of whatever other prerogatives I have going on, either me,
Yeah.
myself, or a church or a church body or whatever the case may be. So the relationship there is that folly is leaven, right? And a little
Yeah.
leaven leaveneth the whole lump. So I have to cast out the leaven where I find it, precisely because I don't have control over or understanding of how much leaven I can take in without the whole thing rising.
Yeah. I mean, so in a sense, we could, the same thing that the woman author that I was referring to
Yeah.
earlier was making about, the spheres, the church ecclesiastical sphere, the home sphere, and then the civil sphere.
Yeah.
That patriarchy always bleeds into that civil sphere. You could make the same argument back, couldn't you? The opposite of patriarchy, the leaven of anti-patriarchy, however you want to call it,
Yeah.
bleeds back into the home and the church then.
Yeah, correct. And Christianity will generally replace just a fairly clear example is that Christianity supplants goddess worship, and that goddess worship will very often be tied to a matriarchal structure.
Hmm.
We currently have something like this burgeoning in the uh, anger that we're supposed to have over destroying Mother Earth and incurring her wrath through
Hmm.
climate change. The religious structure of that entire narrative or discussion is fundamentally matriarchal. That
Hmm.
she's angry at us and she's going to get back at us. Matriarchy is the other option. So
Hmm.
this is this is part of the existence of a binary of the sexes, is that you only actually have two options. You can't have an utter absence of rule. That's the literal meaning of anarchy. You
Hmm.
either have in any given sphere patriarchy or matriarchy.
Hmm.
That's what there is. So the family can be headed by mom or dad. The divine design there is headed by dad, but it can be headed by mom or dad, but it can't be headed by nobody.
Hmm. Yeah. And I've always sort of viewed it as like godly patriarchy or demonic patriarchy.
Yeah, yeah, and it can be a mess. It can be a mess, right? It can obviously be a
Hmm.
mess. I mean, to say patriarchy by itself is just going to save us all is not itself specifically true. Patriarchy has to
Yeah.
be exercised in the image of the Father himself, but
Yeah.
um, you can have bad patriarchy. You can also have, regrettably, matriarchy, and
Hmm.
those are the options. I mean, you
Yeah.
don't there is no other one. There is no one where we're all the same or we're all whatever the word equal means.
Yeah.
That's not available. That's not actually on the drop down
Mm.
menu.
Yeah. Now, is that just because, so obviously that is because of design that's baked in, right?
Yeah.
That's how it's supposed to be. Um,
Well,
in the sense that there has to be someone responsible.
because the design involves the way that God sets up the spheres is that the design involves responsibility. Okay.
Hmm.
The question is always, who will be responsible for what. That's the question, not whether there will be responsibility, structure, order, command, power, if you want to use that word, but who will have which of those things, to what degree, and for what purpose. So you could say, well, the structure in the marriage is that the husband loves the wife as Christ loves the church, and the wife respects and obeys the husband. That's the structure. You could reverse those things. That would be the antithesis of what God's word says, but you would still have structure, right? Structure, rule, authority, those are not actually optional.
Right.
They're going to be exercised very differently in a matriarchy than in a patriarchy. They're going to be exercised differently by a patriarch who is actually following God's design, which involves love, care, provision, sustenance, cherishing, rather than one who is just there to get whatever he possibly can out of a relationship beneficial only to him. Yeah. But structure is going to be there. that's not an option. So I think that's one of the deepest, let's say, moments of realization and regret that people will have in their marriage, is that their marriage specifically is that they will have run it aground on the rocks of thinking that each was just like the other. And even just on the level of emotional needs, they will realize that that was utterly unrealistic. And it was utterly unrealistic because the emotions are set up for the roles respective to the sexes, and they may have just been unaware of that altogether. The structure, the needs, all of it, and they thought that each was just like the other. And now they despise each other, now that they've learned more about themselves and each other. So in order to avoid that, you kind of have to start out by saying, yeah, there's a structure. Here's a structure. There's a structure because this is how God himself governs the world, both through human vocations and himself. He governs in a structural, ordered way. He is a God of order, not of confusion. And then within this sphere, here's the structure. Here's man, here's woman, here's whatever. And when it's set up that way, it's much easier for people to be like, okay, this is my role. Like, I don't have to do everything. And I don't have to be like a good mom and like a kind of okay dad, or vice versa. I can just be a great mom, or I can just be a great dad.
Yeah. And I mean, the fact that God is Father and that Jesus is the bridegroom. I mean, this image should help point out that I mean, within God's own structuring and how he has structured these things, he is the prime example of.
Right. Yeah. He himself operates within the structures that he has set up for our benefit. I do want to be clear, just because you mentioned it in passing at the beginning, that the idea of the image of God is used seemingly by most contemporary Christians in a way that is most widely articulated by the popes of all people in the past 30 or 40 years, but is not the biblical understanding of the image of God. So if you want to use image of God in a very broad sense and say that it pertains to humanity and that we still have it in the sense of saying that like our life is worth not destroying needlessly and murderously, that's fine. The way the term is traditionally used has to do with possessing holiness and righteousness, not that God like has a body or something, and therefore somehow the man bears a greater impress or the sole impress of the image of God, and that somehow therefore the female doesn't exactly. Male and female possess the image of God in original righteousness and holiness. They lose it through the fall. That's now being renewed in the image of Christ. Paul says that's now being renewed day by day, whether you're male or female. So that doesn't have to do with the relationship between the sexes. That relationship is articulated as a relationship of headship. And so the male is their intermediary between Christ and his wife, as Christ is his head and the head of Christ is the Father. But that is not a relationship of some sort of lacking or on the other hand, possessing the image of God. That's a relationship of provision or care, and not as if somehow Christ is somehow lesser than the Father. just so the woman is not somehow lesser than the man, but she is protected by him, and she therefore is submitting to him as her head.
So, in terms of distinction, then about women, you mentioned like mother of the living, um, focused on kind of the entirety of the household, kind of that sphere, more intimate, more close. What sort of then teaching does the scripture point women to focus on as a general principle versus not focus on? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if you think about older women in Titus 2, older women whose households have changed in their shape, or maybe they have become part of someone else's extended household as they get older, are given a set of tasks to teach to younger women. And those involve loving their husbands and children, working at home, and so on. That sphere of a closer life than the man will lead, because the man's vocation as to what he's going to do daily is going to be more varied, usually, even if he's a farmer and always is within sight of his house, certainly in the ancient world. So her duties are about the building up of the household, in the same way that the man's duties are for the provision of the household and the destruction of everything that threatens the well-being of that household, whether we're talking about idolatrous kings or foreign wars or whatever the case may be. Her role is the building up there of that household. And this has to do with the continuation through marriage of the establishment and extension of dominion over the whole earth. That dominion is exercised and established and then extended in different ways by man and woman. And the woman's role in dominion has to do with the well-being, the welfare, the upbuilding of the household, both its people, but also its resources, so that its people can build these things up. That's what is meant by a closer sphere. So there's a geographic element to that. There's also just a different perspective on life. This is one reason I think that women are the only human beings capable of actually multitasking, because they actually need to in a closer sphere, whereas men are not. I don't believe we are built for multitasking. I don't think we're capable of it.
Yeah.
We are built for focused work, generally on exterior or external, or things out in the world, not the simultaneous management of people in a very close group, as well as all the things that they need, that women are actually built of.
Mm-hmm. So you do get this sense when you read through the scriptures, when it's talking about like, this is what men should do, this is what women should do, that he's not giving like a daily checklist. On Monday at 10 a.m. you need to do this, and on Tuesday at 3:30 this needs to be on your calendar. He's giving you kind of overarching principles of what to focus on, that you, as you described, you learn how to put into practice and say, you know what, maybe that's not actually carrying out that principle. And then, through confession absolution with, depending on whether it's the male or female, you start again and try to see what those principles, how they're actually played out in real life. Is that
exactly.
the sense?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think this is part of the recovery of manhood too, is that manhood is not some sort of performative thing involving cigars and watching football together, right? Because the principles that are laid out are not about consumer objects, in the same way that being a woman does not involve a certain possession of a certain number, color, or nature of dresses. It involves understanding what your role is, and then learning to play it better and better for the betterment of your nearest neighbors, And, I mean, as we wrap up, I think that is maybe one of the things we haven't discussed, is that the reason that any of this sounds limiting to anybody is because I'm not sure that in our heart of hearts, any of us is actually convinced the family is the most important thing in life.
Yeah.
So to the idea that your sphere would be close or would be, quote, limited to the family, as if the group of people you would call for on your deathbed is somehow like, that's not enough. That's not worth it. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
I think that the conviction that that's actually like worth someone's entire life and efforts, that's like, my wife doesn't stay at home. She works only for our family, because that's how much it's worth. Yeah.
Yes.
Working at home. I mean, that's the tightest phrase. That's how much it's worth, because we actually, these people are like, this is what's important in this life, So I don't really see that as like, well, we just kind of chose to do this and it's whatever, and it doesn't matter. I mean, if there are a limited number of human beings that you would want to see at the time that you're dying, or that you would regret not having seen before you die, or you would regret for the rest of your life if you never talk to them again, how is that not worth it? I don't understand that. Like your boss, your paycheck, none of that is going to matter nearly as much at all. So if that's the case, then these sorts of decisions become a little bit easier, and sacrifice for them becomes simpler or clearer, maybe not easier, just because it's simple to see that this is essential and the rest of it could fall aside. We could make money in some other way or whatever. Yeah.
I do think at least at some level, the people think that they are putting their family first, and they're somewhat deluded into thinking what that means.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. That's right.
So it's I'm doing all of this so that you can not be good, but have better things than I had.
Right. Yeah. And that has to do with an understanding of the household and the family and people's futures as simply material.
Yeah.
And that if we have more of this, it will be good. And the idea that I keep returning to is that money is tricky in the Bible. It could be great and it could be horrible depending on how we use it. Yeah. Family is not discussed in those terms. The existence of children is not discussed in those terms. It's an unadulterated good. But the idea that somehow your family will be constituted by having certain amounts of stuff or things, even before I was a Christian, I knew that because, the Confederate Railroad song, Daddy Never Was the Cadillac Kind, says the more I give them, the more they want, about his kids in the 1980s. So like, I knew that the more you have, that doesn't make your life better or your kids better or anyone happier. So like, again, these are issues often of general revelation. So I hope that God's Christians who also have the light of the scriptures begin to learn these things as well.
Yeah. The way I always put it to my folks is, when you look at your children, do you imagine a future doctor or lawyer, or someone who will either spend eternity with you in heaven or hell?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And,
life goals.
Yeah, exactly. So this, let's get things into perspective.
Right.
So, well, I think we're up on time here. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we could say a lot more, but I think your discussion, or at least you're focusing on what are the general principles, to not be angry about it, to not spend our time being wrathful or defensive, but seeking to learn and grow in wisdom and stature in the principles that God in his mercy has laid down for us in creating us, so that we can excel in the things that he has created us to be and do. Yeah. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, it's always my pleasure. Thank you.